One of the things I do is I make a distinction between microevolution, which can be observed and experimentally verified and validated, versus macroevolution. Macroevolution refers to significant, dramatic changes that occur in living things over many generations, over vast periods of time. And since we, as humans, we live 60, 70, 80, even 100 years, we cannot actually observe macroevolutionary processes that occur over periods of 100,000 or 10 million years. So we can't watch these things happen in real time because we don't live long enough to see it happen. We can watch small changes occur, called microevolutionary changes, but we can't see macroevolution. So we, obviously in Darwin's theory of evolution, it submits that there were these vast changes in living things over time. All living things started out, first there were the simple single-celled organisms. Closest living relatives today to the first life forms are bacteria, and then they changed over time and evolved into organisms of increasing number of cells and increasing complexity until we ended up with all the various life forms that we have today. And of course, over that period of time, not only have new living things evolved or formed, but many living things have become extinct and they're no longer alive. So again, the whole point of theory of evolution is the kinds of living things that we see on Earth has changed over time, and it will continue to change over time. So then a large part of what I dealt with on the video is providing what we might call circumstantial evidence of that macroevolutionary changes have occurred on Earth. We can't see it in real time. We can't carry out a simple experiment to demonstrate it, but nevertheless there is circumstantial evidence. And I likened it, I said it was a little bit like the use on a episode of CSI, crime scene investigation, where at the scene of a crime and somebody commits a murder, most of the time when somebody is murdered, nobody was there at the time to see it happen. Nevertheless, they're still able to prosecute somebody and find them guilty because there is enough circumstantial evidence that points the finger at who committed the crime. So similarly, we went through various lines of circumstantial evidence to substantiate the theory of evolution. And possibly by the end of the video that you watched, maybe you were convinced that in fact there is enough overwhelming evidence that macroevolution has occurred, and maybe you weren't convinced. My job is not to convince anybody of anything, but at least to make you aware of the scientific evidence that has been accumulated to substantiate that the overwhelming number of biologists and scientists accept it. Now, having done that, I'm going to do something that I don't know if any other biology teacher does. I'm going to try to punch a hole in the whole theory of evolution. So in the video, I tried to show you the evidence. Let's see if we can knock down the theory. I'm going to tell you ahead of time, I'm going to raise a few questions, and it's going to be limited because of time. Given more time, I would try to even raise more challenges to the theory. And then I'm going to, after I challenge the theory on one facet or another, then I'm going to respond the way somebody who is a proponent of the theory of evolution, the way they would respond to the challenge. And you can decide whether they have adequately responded to the challenge or not. And I think in most cases, the challenges are good, but the response is also equally good. So here's a common challenge to the theory of evolution. The theory of evolution says that living things have changed dramatically over vast periods of time because the Earth is about 6 billion years old. And living things first appeared on this planet, based on evidence, about 3.5 or 4 billion years. It's hard for us to even imagine a billion years. Do you know that all of recorded a history of mankind, going back to ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia, is only about 5,000 years of recorded history? So 5,000 years is, we can analyze things in ancient Sumeria or Egypt 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years ago. That's it. So we have to imagine not 5,000 years, not 50,000 years, not 5 million years, not 500 million years, but 3.5 billion years. It's hard for us to imagine that vast amount of time. And the idea is that given such vast amounts of time, living things could have indeed changed dramatically from what they were. They can change small amounts over 1,000 years and presumably to a much greater extent over 100,000, a million, or a billion years. So one of the common challenges is, how do we know the Earth is 6 billion years, or that living things, these fossils that we find? When we date these fossils and we say this fossil, this bone, is 1 million years old, it's 500,000 years old, it's 50,000 years old. Well, maybe we're wrong with radioactive dating and some of these other methodologies. Clearly, if the Earth is not 6 billion years old, if these fossils are not truly 50,000 of 1 million years old, if the Earth were in fact only a few thousand years old, then there's no way that macroevolution could have occurred. Living things cannot change so dramatically in just a few thousand years. So, one of the challenges that's commonly raised is the world, the Earth, as we know it, really as old as we think it is? But in response to that challenge, evolutionary biologists would say that the methodology used in radioactive dating of fossils, in estimating the age of Earth, and we're going to explain more about radioactive dating when we get to chemistry, there's no reason to doubt the validity of this methodology. It was developed by not biologists but physicists, and physicists say that to the best of our knowledge, the rate at which radioactive isotopes change from a radioactive form to a stable form, there is nothing that can alter that rate of radioactive decay, and therefore using radioactive dating is totally accurate. And the various other methodologies that are used to estimate how old these fossils are, how old the Earth is, there's really just there's nobody who's been able to show that those methods are not indeed accurate. But certainly if anybody could show that the methods are not accurate, then, and the Earth were only a few thousand years old, we would have to reject the theory of evolution by natural selection, because it requires vast amounts of time to occur to see these dramatic changes of life forms, requiring hundreds of millions and billions of years to occur. All right, let's take a look at another challenge. Number 2. This is a strange challenge, not one that you would have thought of. If the Earth has been changing so dramatically over these last 3.5, 4 billion years, there's been all these climatic and geologic changes. There have been, just as we see today, there's been earthquakes and volcanic activity. There's been times when the Earth has been real hot. There have been ice ages where the Earth has been cold. We know that. The same methodology that tells us that the Earth is warming, which there seems to be evidence of, is the same evidence that's used to tell us that Earth used to be colder and there were ice ages. If there are hurricanes and tornadoes and all these other geological, environmental changes that always occur over time, and that's been the basis of causing living things to change and adapt to these changes in the environment, changes in the climate and so on, then how come we have found fossils of cockroaches that pretty much look like modern cockroaches, and these fossilized cockroaches have been dated by radioactive dating to be 345 million years old, and they pretty much look like the cockroaches that live today in crawling around in our kitchen. So if there's all these climatic changes and all these living things are changing and adapting to the changes in environment, why didn't cockroaches change? So what would an evolutionary biologist, how would they respond to that challenge? Kind of a strange challenge. And they'd say, you're right. All these other living things have changed because they've been exposed to these changes in the environment, and if the nature is selecting which ones survive and causing those that are not well adapted to the environment, they're causing them to die. That's called natural selection, as I described in the video. Cockroaches obviously were well adapted for all these environmental changes, at least in the location where cockroaches live. So you'd say, what? Well, where do cockroaches live today? You'd say, they're in my kitchen. They're crawling around in the cabinets. They come out late at night and they scavenge for food. And then in the daytime, you know, or when I turn the lights on, they crawl back into the cabinets and they hide in the dark. And they hide in the nooks and crannies of my cabinets. That's right, that's where cockroaches live today. But let's go back in time, before there were houses that people lived in. So obviously, if we go back before there were homes, the cockroaches could live in a modern kitchen. They couldn't live there. Let's go back further in time before there were even humans. So if we go back further and there are no humans, where are cockroaches living? Cockroaches out in the wild, when they're not living in your house, are living in places that are similar to the nooks and crannies of your house. They live in caves. They live under rocks. And so they live in these dark places where they can come out at night and scavenge for food. That's their MO, their modus operandi. That's the way they operate. So if you're a cockroach living in a cave, it really doesn't matter whether the earth is warming up or there's ice age and it's cooling down. Inside that cave, things don't change much. Under the rock, there are not a lot of changes occurring. So if cockroaches are well adapted to basically live in nooks and crannies and caves and hiding under rocks and so on, where the environmental changes don't really affect them, they're not being pushed, as it were, to adapt or evolve. There's no selection as to which one of them will survive and which ones don't survive. They're all kind of surviving pretty well as it is. So that's the way an evolutionary biologist would respond to the challenge of why is it that some organisms have changed dramatically over periods of time, and other organisms, like cockroaches, haven't changed much at all. Basically, the way they live, they're not affected by changes in the environment to any significant degree. So there's been no natural selection affecting which ones survive, which ones die, and resulting in adaptation over generations, known as evolution. Let's try a third challenge. And each of these challenges, obviously one could add to the number of questions or challenges, but one could also add to the responses. I'm just limited in time. A third challenge. You know, we have been breeding dogs for thousands of years. It appears that the original dog was somewhat similar to a present-day wolf. It wasn't a wolf, but it was something similar. It's believed that the dog was the first animal domesticated by man. Then we domesticated cats and cattle and sheep, and these are our domesticated animals that we raise and that live with us as pets and so on. We have not domesticated lions and tigers and zebra, but we've been breeding these dogs, and we've created all kinds of weirdo dogs over time. I mentioned some of this on the video. So we've got Afghan dogs that were bred in Afghanistan that have this nice long straight hair. And we've got poodle dogs with curly hair, French poodles that were bred and developed in France. We've got Irish setters from Ireland, and Scottish terriers, and German shepherds. And you can see in their name, it tells you commonly where they bred them. And we've got wiener dogs, those kind of wiener dogs, the dachshunds. I don't know why we needed to breed a dog that was shaped like a hot dog with short legs, but we did. So, we've got these dinky little chihuahuas, these Mexican chihuahuas that are slightly larger than a rat. And we've got Great Danes who were bred in Denmark, and they are the size of small ponies. Now, so the challenge is this. Okay, we've been breeding these dogs for thousands of years. We've got all these different varieties. But you know what? They're still all dogs. They're still all dogs. None of these have become some other kind of organism yet. And in theory, all these dogs could still mate with one another. Although the very thought of a Great Dane mating with a Mexican Chihuahua is not a pleasant thought. All right? Now, so the challenge is, okay, we've been breeding them for all these thousands of years. They're still dogs, see? They don't ever become anything else other than what they were. But this has only been a few thousand years. 5,000 years, 10,000 years at the most. I've said that macroevolutionary changes require more than just a few thousand years, the time of recorded human history. It requires hundreds of thousands, millions of years. But let's consider this. If mankind were to continue to try to breed these dogs further, and we keep trying to breed dogs that are even larger than Great Danes are today, and at the same time we continue to try to breed dogs that are even smaller than a Mexican Chihuahua, then if that were to occur, then clearly we are going to reach a point where this larger dog that's bigger than a Great Dane simply will be physically unable to mate with another dog that is even smaller than a Mexican Chihuahua. It won't be possible for them to mate with one another. And at that point, where they are so different from each other, one so much larger and one so much smaller, they have really now represent two different species of what were dogs. Somewhat similar to the idea of donkeys and horses and zebras, because they have changed naturally by natural selection, living geographically in different parts of the earth, to the point where, yes, they still look like a horse-like animal, but they are so different from one another that they cannot successfully reproduce and create a fertile offspring anymore. So that would be what an evolutionary biologist would say, that there's not really a limit to how these organisms can change. Given more time, they can change even more radically than they have. Whether it's nature selecting or whether it's human, artificial selection, in either case, we can see these changes over time. And in the video, I mentioned that not only have we bred all these different kinds of dogs, we bred different kinds of cats. All of the corn, the original corn that the Europeans found the Native American Indians eating, called Indian corn, was a tiny little cob with crooked kernels. We've created these big kernels of corn. We've got blue corn and yellow corn and white corn. We've created all these different hybrids. We've got all kinds of different tomatoes, beefsteak tomatoes, cherry tomatoes, Roma tomatoes. We did all that. We bred all these different types of tomatoes. Originally, there weren't all these different varieties of tomatoes. We've created all these varieties of roses. There used to be a small pink rose, and we bred them. What we call artificial selection into all these different varieties. So if anything we can do, nature can do. It just may take nature more time to see these same changes occur. Let's take one more, a couple more challenges, or at least one more. Again, we could go on, and there are books on these subjects of challenging the theory of evolution, and there are books that respond to the challenges. Let me skip number 4, because number 4 we're going to address later in the semester. But let's look at one of the most difficult challenges, really almost a philosophical challenge, as well as a biological. How could inanimate matter, and the word inanimate means non-living, how could non-living matter evolve into something that's alive? Because that's part of this theory, that originally there was this organic soup in the oceans, and these organic molecules assembled themselves into primitive living things, and then these living things started to evolve and change into more complex living things. And as these living things evolved, they became capable of self-maintenance, of homeostasis, and some of them evolved to the point where they had consciousness. Last class meeting, we defined consciousness as awareness of one's environment. And in the case of, in us, even self-consciousness, self-awareness, or self-cognition. Now, this is such a huge question that I don't have the time to address every facet of it. So I'm just going to focus on how is it possible that, let's say, animals could, over time, evolve to the point where they were aware of their environment, conscious of their environment, awareness, and even to increasingly exhibit some degree of self-awareness or self-consciousness. So let me try to, again, in a very simplified way, just to ask this as a series of questions. Let's imagine we were looking at an earthworm. Now, what do you think? Do you think the nervous system of an earthworm is very complex? No, the nervous system of an earthworm is not really, really complex. It's much more complex than simpler organisms than an earthworm, but it's pretty simple. And how aware do you think an earthworm is of its world? Probably not too aware. You know, if you have an earthworm crawling and you put your hand in front of it, it's kind of stuck. It doesn't really know what to do. You know, it's kind of sits there with your hand blocking that's crawling and forward. It may eventually, maybe, turn to the right or left, and maybe not. It may be just totally stumped. Now, on the other hand, what if we consider a fish? Some of you have goldfish in a goldfish bowl. All right, so you got tropical fish in an aquarium. The nervous system of a fish is more sophisticated than that of an earthworm. How aware are fish of their environment, of their world? Well, you know, if you slam your hand on an aquarium tank, it startles them. And so there is some degree of awareness of the world, of their environment. They can tell, you know, clearly where it's light and where it's dark, and they may prefer to be where it's lighter or where it's darker. And so there's a degree of more sophisticated behavior and awareness of their environment. Let's go a step further up the, quote, evolutionary chain and think about birds. Some of you might have a pet parakeet, a canary. All right, so if you have these birds, so their brain, their nervous system is even more sophisticated than that of a fish. And how would we compare the awareness, the consciousness of a bird with a fish? Well, it is more aware of its environment. It is more conscious. Birds have a more complex behavior. Birds sing songs. They're songbirds. They have characteristic songs, not all of them, but many. They nurture their young. They sit on the eggs until they hatch. They bring food to their baby birds. They teach them how to fly. This is much more complex behavior, and so on. Let's go a step further after birds. What if, let's go to a dog. We'll jump up to a dog. That's a mammal already. So, you know, a lot of us have our pet dogs. Dogs have a much more complex brain than that of that parakeet. And they have much more complex behavior. They're much more aware of their environment. They clearly are times when your dog is happy and it's whacking its tail like crazy. And there are times when the dog is sad and it's crying. And it feels emotions. And it's aware of its environment. When you leave your house and slam that door, it's sad. It's depressed. And when you arrive home, it gets real happy. All right? So it's got a much more complex behavior and awareness of its environment. Let's go to monkeys. So monkeys, how do you think the brain of a monkey compares to that of a dog? Even more sophisticated. And therefore, they are even able to create tools and use a stick as a tool. So what are we noticing? And of course, we get to us. What are we noticing? It seems that the awareness of one's environment and the complexity of the behavior is directly corresponds with the complexity of the nervous system. If the nervous system increases in complexity, it is accompanied by an increasing awareness of its environment and an increasing capacity for more complex behavior. So we're simply drawing a parallel that if living things, if animals could over time develop, adapt, and show increasing complexity of their nervous system, that would be accompanied by increasing awareness of its environment. Now this doesn't fully answer the question, but we're simply showing you that being more and more aware of one's environment does seem to be related to the increasing complexity, the increasing evolutionary development of the brain. Now the point that I want to summarize so far is we could go and spend the rest of the semester raising challenges to the theory of evolution by natural selection. We could say, well, what about this? How are you going to explain that? What about that? How are you going to explain this? And then evolutionary biologists would respond. They would provide evidence. They would suggest, does this seem logical? And you might say, yes, that does. That's a great answer. You might say, that's not a good answer. Again, my task is not to convince you of anything, simply to show you that the reason why most biologists and scientists in general accept the general theory of evolution, even though we don't understand all the details for sure, and all the detailed mechanisms, there is enough overwhelming evidence that living things have changed over time. And there has been vast periods of time for them to change over. What is driving these changes in these organisms over time, what's causing them to evolve? Changes in our world. Because the world changes. We certainly know that living in a modern world, culturally and socially it changes. We're not talking about culture and socially, but we're talking about the climate changes. And again, all these other disruptive geological factors. And this creates environmental selection factors that select which ones survive and leave offspring and which ones don't. Now I want to do one more thing that I don't know of any biologist or even any scientist that addresses, and that's to address the subject of reconciling science and religion, especially as it applies to evolution. Now, over the years, I've had a number of students who are very serious in their religion, and well, you should. I am serious about my religion. I'm an Orthodox Jew. I take it seriously. You know, I just put all my cards on the table. So I'm not a, quote, atheist whatsoever, or an agnostic. So now there are scientists. There's plenty of scientists who are. So students have come up to me and they'll say, well, don't you see a conflict? Like, how do you figure this, how do you fit it together? I mean, because it seems like what science says, what biology says, what evolution says, absolutely contradicts my religious values. So let's see if we can address this. And again, I'm doing this to help people out if it's helpful. I'm not doing this to make people believe anything. That's not my purpose. But I'm just assuming these are good questions to ask. There's nothing wrong with raising these questions. And I'm just sharing these thoughts as somebody who has dealt with these questions over many, many years. So this is a list of 4 philosophical, overarching concepts of dealing with the problem of science and religion. And I'm going to address at least 3 of the 4. If I had time, I'd address all 4, but it's not really important. So the first one is a philosophical concept called scientism and naturalistic evolutionism. The second, theistic evolutionism. The third, progressive creationism. And the fourth, biblicism and recent creationism. All right, let's look at number 1, scientism and naturalistic evolutionism. What is that? This is a philosophical belief that there is all that exists in our entire universe is the physical reality that we see or that we can measure. There is nothing supernatural about this world. There is no God. There is nothing supernatural. What you see is what you get. And that's all there is. It's a materialistic view of the world. So for many of us, you might be saying, so like scientism and naturalism, so that's like science, right? That's science. No, it's not. It's a philosophical belief that there is nothing more than the physical reality of the world. And there are problems with this philosophical approach that where there are problems even in terms of dealing with science. And let me just raise 1 or 2 real quick problems with this philosophical belief that all there is a physical reality and nothing more. In an astronomy class, and some of you have had an astronomy class, they will address the subject of cosmology, the origin of the universe. And the modern theory, called the Big Bang Theory, is that the universe, our universe, is about 15 or 20 billion years old, based upon the evidence. Anybody had an astronomy class? Nobody? Is that about what they said? So they'll say, okay, so the universe is 15 or 20 billion years ago. So what do you mean it was 15 or 20 billion? What if we went back in time, 20 billion years ago? Where was the universe? There was no universe. You'd say, well, where did it come from? Well, the modern theory says that at some point, about 20 billion years ago, there was a massive and immense amount of energy, unbelievable amounts of energy that appeared as a pinpoint, and it started to cool, and actually it started to expand outwards, And as this tremendous amount of energy, incomprehensible amount of energy, started to expand, it started to cool. And as it cooled, over billions of years, it formed into the galaxies and stars and planets and all the celestial objects in the universe.
If there was nothing, no universe or anything, where did that energy come from?
That's the question. You just raised it. Because I was just saying, you might say, well, so if you take this physical reality, and if that's all there is, how do you explain where the universe came from? The answer is, we can't. We can't explain how does everything come from nothing. So, we can go back in time, and we can say that the universe, there was this big bang of energy, and this has expanded, and our universe right now continues to expand outward as it continues to overall cool. And there's changes in our universe. We know that stars die and new stars form, and so there are changes in our universe, but we can't know where the entire universe came from. How could it have come from nothing? There's other challenges with just saying all there is a physical reality to the universe, because even though we talk about how the universe has changed over time, our planet Earth has changed over time, life has changed over time, the sheer statistical improbability of how a random universe could form itself in increasing complexity, culminating in a creature like us that can actually is aware of being aware of our existence is possible, but extremely probabilistically and statistically highly unlikely. So whether we say that there was the force created it, that there was some supernatural power, whether you say it's God or whatever you might call it, we don't really have any other way of explaining it. Now, science basically it doesn't deal with the question. They would simply say in science, we can't ask what was there before there was a there. We can't say, you can't study something before it exists. So they simply say, you can trace the universe back to where it began, and it seemed to have appeared out of nothing. And we can't go backwards before there was, when there was nothing. We can only study something once there is a something. So in case you thought that science can basically answer these things, it can't. All right, well, let's look at another approach. So number 4 is kind of the exact opposite of number 1. This is called biblicism and recent creationism. And this is the philosophical belief that there is, if you read a Bible, and you read that Bible literally, and assume that the words it says can be taken absolutely literally the way they're presented, so there is a supernatural force called God, and that means that creates problems with trying to reconcile that with what scientists say. So this is the idea that the earth was created by a divine power, God, over 6 days. God rested on the 7th, and the entire world is a few thousand years old. Obviously, if one accepts that premise, then you reject that the universe is 20 billion years old, and the earth is 6 billion years old, and life has evolved over vast periods of time, 3.5 or 4 billion years old. You have to reject. You reject that aspect of astronomy, you reject this aspect of geology, you reject this aspect of biology. That's rejecting a lot of science. I want to remind you, there's actually many Bibles. There's not just one. So usually you can run into problems depending upon which Bible you're looking at. Usually this is a kind of a, quote, fundamentalist approach, where one is reading the so-called Jewish Christian Bible. It's usually read in English. I might just mention that English, the original Judeo-Christian Bible, was not originally in English. It was in Hebrew and not in English. And anytime you try to translate something, There are subtleties of language that are lost, especially if you're going to take those words literally. All right, so that creates a problem. So far, we've suggested there are problems with just saying that you can just view the world with a physical reality and there's nothing supernatural, because you can't explain where the universe came from nothing. And if you take a literal account of a particular biblical reading, then you have to reject a lot of science. And maybe you don't want to reject so much science, because science is the basis also of how your cell phone works, and how you send rockets to Mars, and your computer, and treatments for cancer. So maybe we want to be careful about how much we reject of science. Let's try another approach, another philosophical approach, number 2, theistic evolutionism. This is kind of an interesting set of words. Theology, theo is a Greek root that means God. And evolution means changes over time. So this is an approach where a creative force, you can say God, has directed these changes over time. And again, to put my cards on the table, this is more where I fit. But in this approach, it says that, you know what, the the universe is 20 billion years old, and life has evolved over 3 or 4 billion years. But the only way we can explain where this whole universe came from and how these improbable events have occurred is to assume that there are forces beyond our ability to detect them, to measure them, and so on. Yep.
I was going to say, I think it's interesting because to me, science actually proves religion.
I'm sorry?
I was going to say, to me, science proves religion.
Who proves what?
Science, I said science proves religion.
No, I don't know if you can't prove religion.
No,
But
because I mean, like examples, like, you know how in science they say, like, the continents, they split up over time. There used to be one big continent, but if you look in the Bible, the Great Flood, that's what happened, right?
well, okay. I'm gonna develop my thesis a little bit further here. Now, let me address a couple of other things in terms of this idea of theistic evolutionism. Let's think back for a moment in the biblical account that most people commonly read. So the biblical account, God creates the world over 6 days and then rests on the 7th. Now I guess, if God's God, God could have created the entire universe, the entire world in 1 day. So what's it mean that God took 6 days to do it? What's that telling us? Is it suggesting that it took a process? There was a process in its creation. It wasn't all created instantaneously, all at the same time. And furthermore, how long did each day last? Did it actually last 24 hours? So remember this, if you know your Bible, which day in the biblical account was the sun created? Anybody know their Bible well? The 4th day. So before the 4th day, there was no sun. And when we talk about the sun rising and the sun setting in that last 24 hours, well, you didn't have at least the first 3 days lasting 24 hours. The sun hadn't yet been formed in the biblical account. So we don't know how long those days last. Furthermore, if the only sentient creature that's observing the world at that time is God, and God's eternal. So the Psalms, it actually says that 1,000 years are like one day in the eyes of God. If you live forever, 1,000 years, 1,000,000 years, 1,000,000,000 years is 1 second. So we don't know how long any of these days lasted. So it could have been just a long process of these things happening. But let me develop this even further. Right now, we've been trying to reconcile science and religion and make them fit together. But I really personally think that we don't even have to struggle to make them fit, because they really have totally different purposes. The purpose of science is to explain how the world works in terms of chemistry and physics and mathematics, and to help us find cures for cancer and to treat heart disease and diabetes. That's what we use science and technology for, to make our lives easier, to give us the internet. That's what we use science and technology for. We don't look at the Bible. If you want a cure for cancer, you're not going to find it in the Bible. You better find a cancer researcher. If you've got somebody in your family who's sick, you've got to find the best doctor they have and hope they're doing further research. So that's what we rely on science to explain. When you open up a Bible and you study the Bible, and you study philosophy and religion in general, you're trying to understand how to behave as a person, and how to be a good person, and how to treat your fellow man. When you read these stories in the Bible of how people treated one another, and sometimes they treated one another well, and sometimes they didn't treat one another well, we're supposed to take lessons from that, of how we treat one another. So we're not using the study of the Bible to explain when the next eclipse of the sun is going to occur. And we're not studying the Bible to explain heart disease and the treatment for atherosclerosis. We are studying to explain something that science can't provide us. We had mentioned that science intrinsically is amoral. It doesn't give us values to know how we should behave and what we should do or not do. So when we study the Bible, that's where it says, thou shalt not murder, and thou shalt not steal, and thou shalt not cheat. We're not going to find that in any science book. Not a single science book will you see any statements about how we should treat one another. So maybe we really don't have to worry about trying to reconcile these two. They really have two different purposes, and we need both of them. We don't want to reject science because it's the way to explain the way the world works, to allow us to make better predictions of when things will happen and how they work. And we certainly don't want to reject religion, because if we do that, we will lose our sense of values, and we will lose our ability to know what science and what technology we should do and what science and technology we should not do. So I'm just sharing these thoughts with you. And I've given talks on this subject that have gone on for hours and hours, with lots of questions and debates. So I'm trying to distill this down in a few minutes. But for those people who are devoutly religious, you can remain devoutly religious and still accept most of science. If not everything, at least most of it. And certainly you want to not reject science because of the values, not values, but in terms of what it can provide in terms of explaining the world. And we've also given you, to somebody who hasn't thought seriously about religion and philosophy, remember I asked you to read that little article that science cannot explain who we are and why we're here. And these are really important questions. You've only got so much time in this world, and what you've got to decide what you're here for. All right, I want to address one last thing. And on page B1, sorry about that, it's Roman numeral 2, comparison between Lamarckian and Darwinian theories of evolution. Now, I've mentioned that Darwin was not the first person to ever propose that living things have changed over time. There's Greek philosophers like Herodotus who suggested that. And there was other biologists who predated Darwin who proposed that. In fact, Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, a French biologist, said that living things change over time. But the difference between some of these earlier presentations is the mechanism by which this changes in the living things occurred over time, how they evolved. Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck called his theory of evolution the theory of evolution by inheritance of acquired characteristics. Charles Darwin, as I've described, called his theory of evolution by natural selection. Nature selects. And I want to just compare and contrast those two theories as I wrap up the subject of evolution, because I want to make sure you understand what the modern theory holds. So let's look on B6. So on B6, it's kind of like two cartoons showing giraffes. I don't think I covered this on the video, did I? No. Okay. So in the top set of pictures, This is the theory of inheritance of acquired characteristics. This is the Lamarckian theory of how giraffes evolved over time. And I put a big X there because we reject it. I'm going to explain what Lamarck said, but it's not, there's no basis for it. It's not correct. What we do accept overwhelmingly is the Darwinian theory of evolution by natural selection. So let's compare and contrast these. So what does Lamarck say? Lamarck is trying to explain how it is that based on fossil evidence, over time, giraffes over time seem to have evolved longer and longer legs and necks. Now, here's what Lamarck says. They started out, giraffes all started out with pretty much these short necks, short legs, and they would stretch to reach the leaves on the trees. And when they finished eating the lower leaves, they'd stretch their necks further to reach the even higher leaves. And because they were always stretching their necks, when they gave birth to baby giraffes, the baby giraffes were born with longer necks. That's what it says. The offspring had longer necks that were also stretched because the parents were always stretching them. So his theory is because the parents stretched their necks, the babies were born with longer necks. That's ridiculous. All right? You can stretch your neck all day long, and maybe it'll make your neck a little bit longer. It will not affect your child and the length of their neck. What determines what your child will look at like is the genetic information that's inside the sperm and the genetic information that's inside the egg. And when the sperm genetic information joins, merges, fuses with the genetic information in the egg, now you've got the information that will determine what that child will look like. The only time the environment can affect what the child will look like is if something in the environment alters the genetic information in the sperm or egg. Now, can something in the environment affect the genetic information in the sperm and the egg? Yes. Let me give you a very easy example that we've all experienced. So one of the things that can alter the genetic information in our sperm, in the testes, or the eggs in our ovaries are X-rays. So when you go to, let's say, the dental office, and they say, let's get a set of X-rays of your mouth, right? We want to see if you got some cavities there. Let's see, maybe you need a root canal. All right, so they point that cone-shaped device right at the side of your head, or your whole mouth, this thing stuck in your mouth. But so they get those X-ray films, right? And before they turn on that X-ray machine, they do a couple of things. They put a lead apron over your body, especially the reproductive organs. Now, we know it's not a good idea to really be sitting in that chair because before they turn on the machine, the person runs out of there because they don't want to be anywhere near you when they turn on that machine. Right? So they've left you in that room with that cone-shaped device aimed right at your head. We know that X-rays can alter the genetic information in our sex cells, our reproductive organs, and that could result in a change in our children, what they look like, and not for the better, but for the worse. All right? Because there's an old adage, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. You know, it's probably going to be okay, and anything you change or mutate, it's only going to make things worse. So that would be something in the environment, if it affects our sperm and eggs, it can affect our children. But that's it. Anything that happens to our body, other than our sperm or in eggs, does not affect our children. Because what creates our children is just the sperm uniting with the egg. So anything affecting your brain or your arm or your heart doesn't affect your child, your future child, unless it affects your sperm or egg. Humans have kind of removed themselves from natural selection. The animals in the wild are still being selected by nature. But we as humans, look, I'm wearing glasses. Out in the wild, I would have crashed into a tree while running or just died because I couldn't find food. If you're deaf, you get a hearing aid. When we're cold, we go into a house and turn on the heater. When we're hot, we turn on an air conditioner. If we've got diabetes, we take medicine to keep us alive. We're not going to die from diabetes. If we've got heart disease, we take medication for our heart. Animals in the wild are not doing that. They don't have air conditioners, they don't have heaters. And so what that does is people who might have died in the past from disease and illness are kept alive and have children. And of course, those children are at increased risk of inheriting some of those same genetic characteristics and tendencies to certain diseases. We know certain diseases run in families. Diabetes and heart disease, even cancer runs in families. Out in the wild, some of us might have died. But in a social setting, using our scientific and technological knowledge that we have, so we're kept alive. We wear glasses, we use hearing aids, we have heaters, we have air conditioners, we have dishwashers, we have cars, somebody who can't walk. So, now they have motorized wheelchairs. If you were out in the wild, how are you going to survive if you can't walk? Let's deal with the Darwinian approach. So if we reject Lamarck, so what does Charles Darwin say? Charles Darwin begins, the very first tenet or concept of the theory of evolution, according to Darwin, is that there is natural variation among all living things. So Darwin starts out with the premise that giraffes had shorter necks, but they didn't all have exactly the same length neck. And there were giraffes that had a little bit longer necks and some with a little bit shorter necks. Just like there are humans today with longer necks or shorter necks, a little bit. But Darwin says, even the one with just a slightly longer neck could reach those leaves that were a little bit higher up than the giraffe with the shorter neck. And if this means that the giraffe that was simply genetically going to have a shorter neck doesn't get enough food to eat, then it dies and doesn't contribute to the next generation. And this giraffe with the longer neck is the one that reproduces, leaves offspring, and when it has offspring, baby giraffes, are all of the baby giraffes going to end up with exactly the same length neck in the next generation? No. Well, no, they wouldn't. Are all your brothers and sisters absolutely identical? No, they're not. So are all the puppies in a new litter of puppies absolutely identical? They're all different. They're different combinations. And when you look at puppies, the one's a little bit bigger and one's a little bit the runt. And so on. One's more aggressive, one's more passive. They're physical differences, behavioral differences, genetic, so they're all different. The puppies and the kitties and everything else. So in each generation, there's still going to be diversity. There's still going to be differences among those giraffes. And in each generation, the one with the longer necks always seem to have the advantage in this setting or environment where there's limited food resources that grow high on the trees. So over time, if the nature, in a sense, is always selecting for those giraffes that have the longer neck, then what we're going to see over time is this tendency to see longer and longer necks with each generation.